Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bangalore International Centre. BIC is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversation, intellectual dialogue, exchange of ideas, arts, and culture. Today's program is House of the People, Parliament and the Making of Indian Democracy. While there's overwhelming support for democracy in India and voter turnout is higher than in many Western democracies, there are low levels of trust in political parties and elected representatives. House of the People, Parliament and the Making of Indian Democracy, written by Ronojoy Sen, looks beyond Indian elections, which has increasingly occupied analysts and commentators, and focuses on the Lok Sabha. The author will be in conversation with Aparna, Chandra, and Rajeev Gowda, moderated by Nitin Pai. I request all of you to please switch off your mobile phones or put them on silent. Kindly refrain from flash photography or videography. On to the panel.
Thanks. I think it should be the author will be in conversation with the audience, and the rest of us are just stage props, non-playing characters, as they call it in computer games. But really, I'm glad that we have an opportunity to discuss this at this time, on this day, because I think Ambedkar Jayanti coincidentally is a fantastic day to discuss this, and I think we can have a very rich conversation here with the talent which is out in the audience as well as the panel here. We have a bit of a logistics issue which will sort of change this panel a bit. Professor Rajeev Gowda has to go to the other session here, and I would normally have prevented him from doing so, making some Congress-related jokes. But I can't, because it's a family function for him. It's a function that's honoring his wife's grandfather, and I think it's legitimate for a Congress party leader to do to attend like that. No, I mean he's one of the most wonderful. I mean, even when he was the MP, he would come in and attend conversations like this, sitting on the floor, with the audience, not insisting on VIP privileges, etc. So I do feel bad when I have to rag him about these things, but sometimes you just have to rag them because they belong to Congress party. But anyway, so we'll do it this way. We'll have this conversation initially between Ronojoy and Professor Rajeev Gowda for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then what I'll do is I will open it up to you. You could start by asking questions or making comments about the book or the topic in general, and then let us as a panel respond to you, right? So it's much more interactive that way. It's richer that way, so we're not going to do download the session. My job as a moderator is not to inflict my views on anybody, but I would play the role of a provocateur as well as a traffic policeman. So that's only my job, right? So why don't we start with Ronojoy? Why don't you just get us off the mark with the ideas in the book, and then put Rajeev in a spot so that he can respond. Yeah, it should be on.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Nitin, for the introduction. You know, I speak very softly, so if you can't hear me, just raise your hand. So I'll just do a very...
Could just come up in front.
So I'll just do a very quick summary of the book, maybe in 5 to 7 minutes. Partly because, there's such a lag between, writing of an academic book and publishing that you often tend to forget what you've written. But also, I think, as Nitin mentioned, I'd rather be more interested in listening to what you, the audience and the panelists, your thoughts on the issue, rather than sort of hearing myself speak. So the book is sort of a biography of Indian Parliament, and I focus on 4 broad sort of themes. But before I do so, I have an introductory chapter looking at the sort of long period, almost nearly a little less than a century, of what might be called constitutional experiments under the British, beginning with the 1861 so-called Councils Act, all of which eventually lead up to the formation of the Constituent Assembly, which of course, as many of you are aware, sits between 1946 to 49. So besides that chapter, the other 4 chapters are sort of theme-based. So the first one looks at the changing political as well as social composition of Parliament. The political composition, the story is relatively more well known. The social composition and its changes are relatively less so. I do have some figures and graphs to document that change, and I draw some tentative conclusions, but I'm happy to talk about that if it so interests you. The second sort of theme that I look at is disruptions in Parliament, which in a sense I think defines Indian Parliament, not just the last few years, but if we go back, I would say to the last sort of decade and a half. And I document a little bit of the history of disruptions, which I sort of point out actually goes back, not in this sort of sense where entire parliaments get paralyzed, but disruptions itself, walkouts, tearing up of bills in the floor of the House, etc., have a fairly long history, and I document that. But I also sort of look at, sort of the tipping point, which happens, as I argue, in the, roughly in the 70s or so. So that's sort of a chapter on the disruptions. Then I have a chapter on probably the sort of least or one of the more understudied aspects of Parliament, namely the committee system. It was, and I sort of quote him, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Inter Walter Bagehot, or as, of the economist, the author of the English Constitution, one of the things he said, a big meeting never does anything. And I think that's sort of perfectly true for Parliament. I think much of the real work happens inside of committees. And, the committee system, like many other aspects of or features of Parliament, goes back to the British era. So, the Public Accounts Committee, or the PAC, is the oldest committee. And it, for those of you with a penchant for history, would know, the 1919 Montagu-Kempsford reforms. That's when the PAC first came into being. And subsequently, there's been, expansions in bits and pieces. But the real big expansion happens in 1993 under Narasimha Rao, and which is sort of the less noted sort of features of the early 90s, which was, of course, a very exciting phase for Indian politics with Babri Masjid, with Mandal, etc. But this was a sort of incremental reform which happened, I think, which had a fairly large impact on India's institutions and Parliament in particular. So I look at committees, both, what it has brought onto the table, but also the drawbacks that the committee system suffers from. And the fourth major theme or issue that I look at is corruption, both sort of internal to Parliament as well as to external, because that's, again, like disruptions, corruption and criminality, unfortunately, are characteristics of not all our MPs, of course, but many of our MPs. So, I think the 2019, the Parliament, the 17th Lok Sabha, I think roughly 43% or so of the MPs have criminal records. Of course, that does not mean they're convicted, and of course, this whole conviction issue is in the news for obvious reasons now. But so I look at, how Parliament has been able to sort of penalize or discipline errant MPs, but also how they've sort of framed and looked at the larger issue of corruption in politics and in the public sphere. So those are really the four big issues that I look at. And I have a concluding chapter which looks at the contemporary situation, post 2014, and there was a recent review in the Hindu which was critical of the book, saying that that chapter should have been much more sort of central and upfront. But I also believe that you shouldn't sort of let the contemporary, as important as it is, to sort of take over sort of a larger, a longer history of anything. So sort of keeping that dictum in mind, I sort of kept it as a sort of as the concluding chapter. But again, I'm more than happy to talk about the changes that have happened post 2014, and whether some of these we might be unfairly ascribing it to sort of post 2014. Some of them might actually have been around for a bit longer. But again, I do see that there has been a break of sorts there. So I think I'll end there.
Thanks. Professor Rajeev Gowda, I think, he's a good personal friend, but in an entirely unbiased way, I think is one of the most thoughtful parliamentarians we have today. And it's not just thoughtfulness in a broad intellectual sense, but doing the hard work for, in terms of looking at policy issues, looking at the politics of policy issues and presenting it in Parliament. I think very few parliamentarians have done that in recent times. So he's probably the best guy to talk about this. But I'm going to ask you two questions which Ronojoy poses to himself in the book. In the very first thing he says, look, I was interested in two questions. Is Parliament working? I mean, does it really work? And second is, how has India changed Westminster Parliament, right? Let's not worry about the second thing first. That's a matter of interest to historians and intellectuals. But is Parliament working? I mean, does that thing work? For 500 seats, 800 seats, 2,000 seats, I mean, does it really work?
Parliament certainly works. And
I mean, for India.
Yeah. As an institution, it has been weakened by a million knife cuts over the years, but fundamentally, it is a platform where issues can be raised, where where even a prime minister who has essentially a disdain for parliaments and legislatures will actually pay attention to showing up there and speaking and using it as a platform for communicating to the public. But it's also, institutions like the committee system, institutions like question hour, institutions like the debates over bills themselves, all ensure that at least a variety of viewpoints are put forth. Whether those viewpoints actually translate into anything is really the larger question. And that's something that I've often worried about during my 6 years in Parliament. Is it just a talking shop, as the etymology implies? But let me give you one instance, right? So there was something called the Surrogacy Regulation Bill, okay? And it had been passed by the Lok Sabha, came to the Rajya Sabha. I was the lead speaker from the Congress because such technical bills nobody else wants to touch. And I had a very detailed critique of the bill as it stood. At the end of the debate, the Parliamentary Affairs Minister came to me and said, can I take your speech? Even though this bill has been passed in the other house, we're going to set up a select committee, redo the bill, and then, pass it, incorporating some of these critiques. And this is from a government that essentially brooks no criticism, all right? So maybe because it's not a mainstream bill, something like this happened, but this is an indication that the system does work. Some other aspects. For example, right now, we are seeing a variety of bills related to information technology, okay? And public consultation is actually happening. These are put out and inputs are coming in, and based on that, there is some transformation of the legislative enactments that have been proposed. So if you take all these aspects, you can say that it's functioning in parts. Okay, it's highly dysfunctional on multiple other fronts. One is the whole story of disruptions. I have been an active disruptor in my time when necessary.
But Bangalore is a city of disruptors, so
well,
in the industry. So.
Yeah. It's a good term in a different context. Yeah. In a different context. No. The whole idea is you want to put pressure on the government to listen to you. The kind of disruption that you saw in the last session, the second half of the budget session, demanding an apology from Rahul Gandhi, and the government disrupting, that's not routine. In fact, frankly, if you were to speak to any member of parliament, they'll tell you that nobody enjoys the disruption. Everyone enjoys being able to take part in debates and having one say, things like that. And so that's a very, very crucial dimension where more cohesion, more cooperation between the benches, opposition and the ruling party would make a huge difference. There is a business advisory committee. There are lots of efforts to work out cooperative solutions, but not everything. I mean, that's the nature of the political game. There are lots of demands that are difficult for the government to accede to. But the larger issue is really the weakening of the institution with respect to two other dimensions. One is the executive leadership itself. The anti-defection law, which you touch upon at the very end of your book, has, been one of the most counterproductive laws in Indian history. Far from stopping defection, the way it's structured, allowing the speaker to make decisions or not make decisions on ruling out, on expelling or disqualifying MPs who defect, has allowed people to get away with defection all the time. That's one part. But the larger, more pernicious impact has been that it has centralized power in the hands of the party leadership. No MP can stand up and express his or her own view without the threat of being thrown out and losing his or her seat. So this is a real problem. It's led to, possibly even the dynastic politics that you see across parties is partly because whoever runs the party ends up having, tremendous control over legislators and MPs because of the anti-defection law. That's one part. But the other part that you haven't touched upon at all in the book is about the institution itself with respect to the judiciary. If you look at the last couple of decades and the whole rise of public interest litigation, or more than that, judicial activism, right? Every act of judicial activism is an encroachment on the legislature and its domain. And that's been happening continuously. And really, sometimes even constitutional amendments passed unanimously, like the National Judicial Appointments Commission, are overturned by the Supreme Court. Okay, so where is this institution compared to the other?
I'll get him to respond because he's a good guy. He's the best guy to respond because he wrote a book on the judiciary mucking around with policy, right? The first book.
Yeah, with religion. And
with religion,
yeah. So should I just respond to a few of the points?
Yeah, sure, all of them.
Okay, I'll, if I can remember them all. One of the things that you said about disruptions and, the current, the second half of the budget session which just concluded, I think, I was looking at some of the numbers which are generated, very assiduously by PRS, this organization in Delhi, and I think the Lok Sabha probably worked for 5% of its allotted time and the Rajya Sabha for 6%, and which was probably one of the lowest, if you leave aside the winter session of Parliament in 2011, which was entirely washed out due to protests over the 2G, so-called 2G scam. But what was a unique feature of this round of disruptions was that you actually had the treasury benches, leading the disruptions, which was quite unusual. And yesterday I was at another discussion at the Delhi India International Center. And, one of the points that was raised is that this has happened earlier, but my response was, this was over the issue of the creation of Telangana. And this was in 2000, the phase between 2011 to 2014 when Congress MPs from Telangana were actually, protesting as part of the, the ruling dispensation. But the difference was that it was a very small part of the treasury benches that were engaged in acts of disruption. And if some of you might recall, in 2014, you actually had a Congress MP, I think his name was L. Rajagopal, who, used a pepper spray on the floor of Parliament. Then you had someone fainting. So you've had, that element, but I don't think we've seen this phenomenon of the entire treasury bench actually, taking the lead in disruption. So I think that's a somewhat unique thing that we're seeing. Of course, on the committee system, I agree that it's done very good work. But then, there are issues around the committee system too, which I'm sure aware of. One is, of course, the conflict of interest issues, which is we don't really have a sort of clear-cut demarcation of who should be on a committee deciding on a certain issue. And of course, there are also issues of absenteeism, lack of matching expertise of MPs. So, again, you might be better placed than me. I think we often see a phenomenon of members being fairly randomly allotted their, their positions in the committee. I don't think they're sort of first, second choice or whatever. You have some exceptions, but often not so. So those were a couple of points. I think you raised...
If I may,
I'll get Aparna.
One second, Nitin, let me just speak for a few more minutes and then I will disappear.
You have to listen to her before you do.
Okay, no, absolutely. Just some personal experiences there. In terms of allocation, since I'm Professor Gowda, I was automatically assigned to the HRD Education Committee.
Yeah.
But the same committee also oversees women and child welfare, and the Juvenile Justice Bill, when that set of amendments came up, we, with a BJP majority, came up with a report that was totally in contradiction to the government's bill. Okay?
Right.
And so that shows you that committees can function in a very non-partisan and substantive manner. We had a lot of consultations with NGOs and other experts before coming out with our report. So that's the good side. It underlines what you point out in the book. The other side, though, is that I was a member of the Public Accounts Committee, which includes Rajya Sabha members, by the way. And when we wanted to take up the Rafael issue, we got a sense that the ruling party members would not allow that to happen. So we never did take it up, even though technically there were violations of rules, procurement rules. We could have at least taken up that dimension of it, but we never did. So I would say that it's it's a system that's tremendous in its effect and potential, but Lok Sabha members especially are so busy juggling 10 dimensions of their work that they really don't have the ability to contribute as much, and we don't have the support staff to enable members to do even a better job. Okay.
Professor Aparna Chandra. You will also get HRD at one point.
Let's see. I should say, though, on the committee procedure, that with the surrogacy regulation bill, so I've done some empirical work on it, and we were very surprised to get summons from one of the parliamentary committee to come and present our findings to the committee. So and the report there was a very, very substantive report. The work of the committees, even though it does not necessarily have any binding effect, though it does end up coming back into public circulation, and I know working with civil rights groups and civil society groups, then that becomes a way of sort of intervening then with other bodies, with the courts, and it becomes a repository of knowledge and a repository of things that have been said by some authoritative body which can otherwise be used. But I had a question on disruptions to both of you. I was wondering to what extent the phenomenon of disruption that we are seeing in the Indian Parliament is a function of the lack of voice that the opposition has in agenda setting, in any kind of opposition rights, frankly, within our parliamentary system. Is that because you cannot debate, therefore you disrupt, because you don't have control over sort of setting the debating agenda? So to what extent is it a lack of rule setting, and to what extent is it the exogenous factors that you mentioned, which is the theatrics of it, the spectacle of it, and sort of playing to the gallery, so on and so forth? Because I got a sense that it might also be just the fact that the institution is failing.
I'll just add to that. Our MPs, our opposition MPs disrupting parliament because they feel powerless, and our ruling party MPs disrupting parliament because they feel powerless.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. Before
because everybody feels powerless.
Response, maybe I'll just quickly. Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors. I do sort of look at, the early years of parliament. You had a fairly homogeneous sort of composition. The political elite was of a certain kind, and if you sort of look at the numbers, one of the startling things is in the first 2 or maybe even 3 parliaments. A third of the MPs were lawyers, and most of them had some prior experience in the nationalist movement, etc. And that has kept changing to the extent now lawyers, I think, make up something like 3 or 4% of parliament.
And do you think that's a bad thing?
No, I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing. I'm just saying that there was you had a certain kind of. So I look at that. Then I look at sort of the change in political culture. From the sort of 90s, partly dictated by coalition politics, which leads to many more voices there, but also sort of the changing composition of parliament. And I sort of draw this analogy because my last book was on sport. As from the 90s, you saw the Indian cricket team, getting decentered to some extent. So you had, the dominance of Bombay, Delhi, etc., the metropolitan centers undercut by a far more sort of diverse set of voices. So you see a little bit of that happening in Parliament too. But I completely agree. I do mention as one of the reasons is the lack of voice of the opposition. And this was something interestingly mentioned by Prime Minister Vajpayee in a fairly sort of notable speech that he made in 2001, which was on disciplinary decorum, etc., where he says that, till the sort of 70s, he says that there were actually hardly any disruptions, and he sort of hypothesizes, he sort of, throws up the question as to whether if you have a single party majority, whether that sort of leads to, less disruptions. But that is not entirely true, because actually the 1984 Rajiv Gandhi Parliament is severely disrupted from 86, 87 onwards on the issue of Bofors. But just to let you in. You mentioned
he has to step out. So
right.
why don't we just give him a...
No. I just wanted to say that part of it is drama. But the substantive portion is really putting pressure on the government to agree to debates on some subject or to set up a JPC or something of that sort. Right. And that often, it gets to be really contentious. And ultimately, after quite a while, the government may agree. Anyway, congratulations on the book. We need many more such institutional studies. I hope to do one in the Rajya Sabha myself. And while Nitin said it's a family function, it's actually a book launch about my wife's grandfather, H.C. Javaraya, who was one of Bangalore's pioneering horticulturists. And so once this function is over, you're welcome to the auditorium.
Thank you. Wish you well. All the best. More power to you. Look, I've been a little dissatisfied so far, right? Because these guys seem to be all agreeing that this is a fantastic place, everything is okay, committee systems are okay, a lot of people are changing, only 3% of things are lawyers. I mean, look, as a citizen of the country, I look at 6% attendance in the Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha. Lok Sabha is 5%, Rajya Sabha is 6%. I mean, it's terrible, right? I mean, what can you do in 6%? I mean, you go to school for 6% of the time, I don't think they'll give you a report card at the end of the year, right? They'll just send you back. So that is one. The second thing I have is a little more, and I want to shake both of you up. I mean, I would have wanted to shake him because he believes in it as much as all of you do. Look, at one point, I wanted to take my kids to see how democracy works, right? How parliament works. So I thought, let me take them to BBMP, the Municipal Council of Bangalore, and see how debating happens and all of that. So my friend said, hey, he told me in very nice Kannada, hey, karkondu hogta idya, nee first hog nodu. Okay, he said, you go and see it first. So I went there and saw it, and I said, oh my God, I'm not going to bring my children anywhere close. Because, it was like American football. The moment the whistle was blown, the people started sort of pulling at each other's shirts and trousers and all of that, right? So that is the grassroots. And look at the state assembly, it's the same. And now that disease has sort of gone up to the union at the federal level. So my question is, because you tried to answer that question, is it working? It seems to be working in terms of some form, over 50, 70 years it seems to work. But in the recent years, has it really done its job of representation, deliberation, and legislation in the interests of the nation? Judging from the outcomes, not from the process.
Can I add something to that? That...
So, are we going to jump on him?
Yeah, of course. Why not?
Okay.
Since he's no longer there, might as well jump
on him. Yeah, and you can jump on him also, or anyone else. So.
No, it's just a question that I want to pose to you. When you're looking at the working of an institution, you have to have at least some background assumption of what that institution is for, to then say whether that institution is working properly, right, in relation to whatever parameters you have. And I wonder what the imagination of Parliament is. What is Parliament for, right? Is it primarily a representative body? Is it primarily a deliberative body? It doesn't have to be one or the other, it can be both, but what is it primarily? Because only if you assume that the point of Parliament is to deliberate, then there's a whole question about, what is the quality of deliberation? Is deliberation happening, etc., etc. And my fear is that from the or maybe at least for the last 30, 40 odd years, we've seen Parliament primarily as a representative body and not a deliberative body. And it ties into this anecdote that you have towards the end, where you're talking about the Central Vista project, right? And it's challenged, and it's challenged in the courts. And one of the grounds for challenge is to say that people were not consulted, and there was no consultative process before this entire plan was passed. And the government went to the court and argued. But that doesn't matter, because we are a representative democracy. The only point of our democracy is to choose our representatives. That's the only manner in which we are a democracy. We are not a participatory democracy. We are not a deliberative democracy. So this is not an expectation that you can have, that people will be included or that we will have open deliberation before decisions are made. So, just tying it back, not to the structure of Parliament, but also to its content. What is Parliament for?
Right. No, I think, as I said, one need not judge Parliament by, what we've seen in the last session or the last couple of years. I don't want to list all the achievements of Parliament here, but I think it's important to separate, what you call the two functions, deliberative and the representative functions. And that's something, I've tried to sort of look at it through numbers, but I also talk to a lot of MPs, cutting across party lines over the sort of period that I researched this book, from roughly 2010 to 2017, 18 or so. And I think the MPs themselves are torn between, these two functions of representation and sort of the classic sort of parliamentary functions of deliberation, committee work, etc. And almost all of them, all the MPs that I talked to, were of the opinion that constituency work takes precedence over, what they do in Parliament. And, of course, everyone wants to get re-elected, right? And they told me that what they do in Parliament does not really count for much amongst the constituents, It's what they do, on the ground, what they can show. And so that, I think, is a fundamental problem. And that's, of course, not confined to India, but it's, I think, accentuated in India partly because of the size of the constituencies that the MPs represent. Of course, that's something that's also very much in the public sphere now, because we are looking at the expansion of Parliament, and which has its own set of problems. But I think, if I remember the numbers correctly, in 2019, each MP in India was representing roughly around 2.5 million citizens, and I think the number of voters was a little bit less, maybe around 2 million or so. So that's a gargantuan task. I don't think it's possible for any representative, and if you sort of go back to the sort of canonical, Edmund Burke's sense of the representative sort of in his or her body, sort of perfectly sort of encapsulating the constituents' interests, that is a far cry. So I think that aspect of the representation, vis-a-vis whether you want to get re-elected, the constituency, vis-a-vis what you do in the Parliament, I think that's an issue. I don't know what the answer is, but that, I think, is something that needs to be looked at. But on the sort of the greater issue of how far the MPs are able to represent their constituents, that, I think, there is no sort of perfect answer to that. I think if you look at legislations that the MPs are deliberating or debating on, of course they're all, or to a great extent, related to the lives and functioning of both the nation as well as the constituency. So some of them might be issues that might be very abstract, surrogacy, etc. But say on issues like the Farm Bill, you were asking me, why is Parliament necessary? I think precisely because something like the farm legislation, the farm bills, did not sort of go through a due process of the committee system, etc. We actually saw, nationwide protests, which eventually meant that the thing was rolled back. But if it had gone through the due process, which normally would have been followed, they referred to a committee. So I think deliberations would have happened. We might have actually had a better sort of farmers legislation, and it might have worked. So I think again issues like Article 370,
right,
etc.
So compared to letting uncles with tractors determine public policy, we're better off with Parliament.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so let me throw this to you. Let's take a few questions, comments from you. We'll try and get these guys to respond, and then I'll go on my second level of provocation.
Yeah, I think there's a question.
There's a question here.
Okay. Yeah, just go to the. Is there a mic or? Yes. Are you giving a mic? So whoever the gentleman in the red shirt goes to he gets to ask.
So, what Ronojoy said that, I don't have to stand, right?
Yeah, up to you.
So, so the thing is that it's not, the MP's role is, as we know, is to be re-elected. And one of the main tools is also to work in Parliament when you ask questions about your constituency, will the railway line be built? Will we get this road, etc., which is also what MPs are supposed to do in Parliament. So if with all these disruptions you can't do that, and maybe there are other abstract things like Mohua Maitro talking about Adani, which may not affect her constituency of Nodia, but the fact is that if you don't get a chance to do either, then how do you think is this system working?
Sure, you want to clarify?
We'll take so that we get a sense of what people are wanting. Yeah. Go ahead.
So, I have a question in connection with the disruption-related things, that any institution, we are talking about Parliament, let's talk about any organization, a company, an NGO, an educational institution, anywhere where there are people, there is a structure, there is a discipline, there is a disciplinary action, and things of that kind, right? Now we have the highest level of our representatives dealing with the highest institution in the country, and then every now and then disruptions. Aren't there rules where, strict actions, the Lok Sabha speaker, Rajya Sabha speaker, why do they feel powerless in handling and controlling? What drives under the hood where they are not able to control, or they don't have the willpower, or something is stopping? I really fail to understand why this institution cannot be handled with, as ma'am also said, that if discussions don't happen, there are 1,000 issues which are affecting us. Where are we going to get the time to discuss and then resolve them? So what's going under the hood not to be able to control that?
One more at the back.
I think this was.
Huh? No, because we are getting, we'll be biased towards the front. So we'll go to somebody at the back. No, we'll come, don't worry, everybody will get a chance to throw things at Ronojoy.
So my question is about regarding incentives. So when I heard the discussion about disruption and legislation, right? So what is the incentive to deliberate when the incentive for the MPs is to maintain the status quo? Except I think only the people are losing out, but that's a different matter now. So if the incentives are not aligned for betterment, like I don't think people from the bottom of their heart want the country to go forward, or I don't believe that the world is such a nice place. So if the incentives are misaligned, why do we think that the parliament will help in better legislation?
Okay. I'll get Professor Aparna to answer your question first.
Okay.
Why are there no rules for these people? I mean, you're a constitutional lawyer, you should have done something. No?
There are rules. The rules are not enforced. And I think that goes back to the question I was asking Professor Gowda, that in competitive politics, you know that at some point you will be in the opposition. And so there is an interest for everyone to ensure that the opposition is not penalized. It's generally the opposition, current instances notwithstanding, it's generally the opposition that has the need and the incentive to disrupt, because it wants to be heard. There is no system in place for the opposition to claim a time to be heard. or there is very little of that. The government has the agenda setting power. There are no institutionalizations of opposition rights. Right? Even the leader of opposition, who has such an important role to play, we've seen with this current parliament, the entire fiasco around not having an official designation for a leader of opposition and the consequences that that has had. So in these circumstances where we don't have entrenched opposition rights, the opposition, in order to be heard, apart from all other incentives, disincentives, perverse incentives they might have, even if they're genuinely operating, the only way to be heard is to create spectacle and disruption. Disruption is not only something that happens in India, it happens elsewhere as well. There are spaces where you could sort of channel disruption. So Ronojoy gives the example of the US, where there's a whole filibustering process, which is in the, it is rule compliant disruption. But having said that, when a party is in power, it knows that tomorrow when it is not in power, these are the tools of disruption that it will also require, because it will not have the power when it is in opposition. I don't think, and I think this is just a failure of imagination, I don't think our politicians have, and parliamentarians have thought enough about entrenching opposition rights. And perhaps what we've seen in this last 10 odd years, hopefully will mean that come a different time in the future, that there will be incentives to look back, learn from this process, and entrench opposition rights, so that the opposition does not have to resort to disruption in order to get itself heard. I'm saying this is the best case understanding of why disruptions take place, beyond the perverse incentives, beyond the creating the spectacle for its TV audience, so on and so forth, which, I mean, obviously there are those incentives as well.
You could take the other two.
Yeah, no, just again, because I think they've all clustered around the question of disruptions. I think we shouldn't sort of let our view of Parliament be totally colored by, what we've seen over the last, disruptions have been dominant over the last maybe couple of sessions, 1 or 2 sessions between. But, disruptions, even though they've been a critical element of Parliament, but I don't think, we should sort of, we shouldn't color our views entirely. I think when I did my research, often what would happen is the disruptions would happen just as Parliament convened, right? So question hour, unfortunately, would be a casualty. So would sometimes be 0 hour. But then after lunch, actually Parliament would, deliberate, bills would be passed.
After lunch, we all deliberate in a certain way.
Yeah, in a subdued manner, yeah. And oftentimes, Parliament would actually go until fairly late in the night. So, I think we often tend to sort of unfairly, judge, our MPs, Parliament, in sort of speaking in some defense of the MPs. And, for instance, when I was researching the local legislation, eventually what, it was a fairly weak local legislation that was passed. But, the deliberation went on till very late in the night. And if some of you recall, they were televised, etc. So it's not that they are not doing, parliamentary work either. So I think, that's happening. Along with disruptions, there is also deliberations happening. Question hour, again, has historically fulfilled a very important role, but unfortunately, that has been a real casualty in over the last few decades. On the role of the MPs, I tend to disagree. I don't think MPs are really meant to sort of put up a tube well, build a bus shelter. And I think
that's not their job.
I'm not so sure, because I think this whole thing is also tied to this the institution what's known as the MP lads and the MLA lads, which many people think are actually unconstitutional. I'd like to hear your views. It shouldn't be there, although there are other countries which have a so-called constituency fund. I think the role of the MPs, so the role of the MPs is something, whether, they should be, I think that's something again that came out in interviews. One of them said that, I'm a councillor, MLA, MP, everything rolled into one, so I have to, my constituents, like sort of smallest requests. And, they're actually extremely busy, someone was talking about incentives, MPs not having the good of the nation at heart, they're extremely busy, if you sort of, track them, there were like, the constituency demands are extreme, and, one of them, in fact, told me that, I have to sort of laugh, cry, dance, everything over the course of a 24-hour day, because I have to attend funerals, I have to attend weddings, I have to sort of arrange for, hospitalization of constituents. So I think they're doing a hell of a lot of work, but, the kind of work that they're doing, whether that's what they are supposed to be doing, is, I think, a question that really needs to be answered.
Yeah. So I'll make 2 points, and then I'm going to silence this house on the topic of disruption. We will not talk about disruption after this. Okay. The first thing I want to say is, look, MPs do MLAs jobs. MLAs do councillors jobs. Councillor is doing the local engineer's job, right? So basically we've devolved thing. I mean, the MP is not supposed to be looking at bus shelters and tube wells. Probably MLA's job, if it is, but it's really the local councillor's job to do this. But the local councillor is powerless, so or maybe the local councillor is disempowered by the MLAs and the MPs and so on. So there's a dynamic here. But what I liked about what he said, and I think we should take that away, if we take a long view, I think there is something to be said for the institution of parliament. Whereas I started off by being a critic, right? Because I read a 2-volume biography of parliament by Chris Bryant about the British parliament. And it traces it back to all the way from Magna Carta down. And when you take that long view, what you're seeing in today's parliament is like child's play. It's like, these guys are nice people, very, very well behaved. I mean, nobody's chopping off their heads and taking it to the Tower of London. And, that used to happen in parliament, right? So that's the history of this institution. We just think that in 1950 something magical happened and parliament happened. But, history of representative democracy, human history of representative democracy counts for something. It's not like Indians are unusual people that miraculously from 1950 will start behaving in a particular way, right? So those things do matter. In the long view, I suppose there is reason to be optimistic, or at least not so critical about the role of parliament as we might get from seeing the last 10 years. Okay, let me just call, no more talking about disruption.
Could I just quickly interrupt, and before we banish disruptions, just quickly, come back to what Aparna was talking about, the lack of the opposition's role in agenda setting. I think Professor Gowda mentioned the Business Advisory Committee, which is actually a innovation of Indian Parliament, and the ruling, the government in power always has a majority, in the agenda setting. So the opposition, lacks a voice, and it might be heretical to say this, but I think some disruption is not a bad thing, because it does give the opposition a platform, to articulate its interests where it's not being able to. Whether it should be done on the floor of the House is another matter, but it does, it's getting televised, the opposition, whatever they're saying, reaches the constituents. So I think, some disruption is not bad, but of course disruption shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of. So I think in a way it is tied to the lack of voice of the opposition, particularly in context where you have a, dominant, party in power. I don't know whether you want to quickly.
Can I just add to that to say, and this goes back to the point you were making. I thought you were making a different point from whether MP should be involved in, having a tube well installed. I thought your point was that if there's an underserved area, the MP might legitimately say, my constituents, why is the government not building a railway in my constituency? Why is this area underserved? And that's a core representation function beyond the, disbursing the funds through MP lads to get get something built. And that function, I think, is an incredibly important function. It's also an accountability function. So we talked about representation. We talked about deliberation. The thing that we haven't talked about, which ties back to opposition rights, is accountability. Right? Which is not just to say that, I will ensure that the voice of my people is heard in the making of law, or I will bring reason to bear in the making of law, but I will hold the government to account. Right? And that is that function, and you sort of so beautifully detail it out in terms of the initial years of Parliament, where even the government of the day, people in Congress, in the ruling party, are being incredibly ferocious and attacking the government of the day. And of course, the Mundra affair being perhaps the best known example of Feroz Gandhi attacking Nehru.
That's again questioner, right?
Yeah,
It's
right, exactly. But that accountability function, if the government holds all the keys in terms of agenda setting, in terms of what gets deliberated, in terms of the speaker and the speakers, who the speaker is, and the speaker's role in sort of managing affairs of the parliament in being in these committees, etc. How do you hold the government accountable? And which ties back to perhaps the last thing on disruption, that perhaps being disruptive isn't then, in some senses, the only place to be accountable. And if we could shift the conversation a little bit along those lines, I wonder, you mentioned in your book, and that's something now very well acknowledged, that the Constitution is incredibly silent and very weirdly silent on political parties, right? The only mention of political parties comes in through anti-defection. And I wonder to what extent the stuff that should be happening in Parliament is actually now happening behind closed doors in political parties rather than in Parliament, so that what should be happening out front in Parliament is now happening in political parties. And again, it's a failure of our imagination of Parliament that we haven't even accounted for political parties in our constitutional setup.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the thing, just the last word on her question. I think we are just using her as wonderful. But what we're saying is, see, there are methods, there are processes by which MPs and MLAs can intervene in local governance, right? It doesn't have to be MP areas. The MP and the MLA, all those MPs and MLAs elected from Bangalore's constituency can visit the BBMP, attend the proceedings and ask questions or direct. So nothing stops them from doing it, but they don't. Right? So I think they feel it's below their, below their dignity to go into a municipal, but they have formal visitation rights. I think they can't vote, they are not considered members, but they can go there and ask questions and make speeches, etc., right, to influence local governance. They can. So it's not that you need MPL areas to build a bus shelter. The bus shelter should be built by the municipal corporation, which is its mandate. And the MP or the MLA can come and say, hey, this is this underserved area, build a bus shelter there, using the municipal funds. That's the right way to do this, right? But we've...
It's like building an airport or like a railway tracks, like, where...
State government functions.
You're saying that underserved areas where you're trying to, there's been an airport...
Fair enough. I think there's no doubt that there has to be a balance, right? You have to represent your constituency in some ways, at the same time making laws for the country, but you're not a uber municipal councillor, you're not a uber MLA that does all the jobs. If you look at the typical, which I think you gave the example of our friend Charan Singh's grandson, right? What's his name?
Jayant Chaudhary.
Jayant Chaudhary, same story, right? I go to his office, there are a lot of people outside. I ask him, what are they here for? They want gun license, they want reservation, they want admission in colleges. I said, you're an MP, man, this is not your job. He says, if I tell them that, yeah, he says, if I tell them that, he won't get re-elected. Right? So he's got, okay, that's one. Now let's swing away from this disruption business. Okay, anyone who will raise disruption again is a disruptor. We will not accept disruption, right? But let's look at this. You'll have a chance again at the end of the life. You'll have the last 30 seconds to disrupt. But let's go into a sort of bigger audience, right? This is Bangalore, right? This is an IT city. All of us here know about the Turing test. The Turing test is basically to test artificial intelligence, right? You ask a computer a set of questions, and if a person can't distinguish whether that answers come by a human or by a machine, you pass the Turing test. That means an artificial intelligence is as good as a human and so on, right? So I'm oversimplifying it, but that's the Turing test. Now let's do the inverse Turing test, the reverse Turing test. Now, instead of 545 people sitting in New Delhi and voting, let's say we have ChatGPT or an artificial intelligence sitting there, or a computer sitting there and making those decisions. Will the outcomes as far as representation, quality of legislation, fidelity to the constitution, correctness of procedure, spelling mistakes, commas, etc., will it be better with this AI or will with these 545 guys? Question to both of you. Huh? Okay, how many of you think it will be better? This is Bangalore, okay, so there's bias here. So there's only 4, so it's not. How many of you think it will be worse if machines do it? Okay, little more than, okay, many more.
Not saying monkeys
No. Let's be respectful, okay? We elected them. You know why we should be respectful to parliamentarians? Because they are people like us. So if we call them monkeys, then what has happened to us, right? So.
There's also parliamentary privilege that you should be aware of. Like contempt of court, you could be hauled up for
Yeah, we could be hauled up for contempt of parliament. Yeah, I mean, there is such thing as contempt of parliament. Anyway, even this. But why don't you, let's take this seriously, right? Is it that we are just sticking on to this institution because we have it? And, like this very low bar which Churchill said, it's the best form of government except for the others that have been tried. So just because we can't think of anything better, we got to stick with these guys? I mean,
okay.
is it
I mean, I should say, so I didn't think you were being serious. I thought you were, I mean, you said you were going to be provocative. But, I mean, okay, I'm trying to figure where all I should go. But look at the long history of why we fought for representation, right?
But not by humans, right?
No. Put the parliament aside. The parliament might be a flawed organization. But think about why it is that the history of political struggle, and I don't mean just in India, I mean globally, the global history of political struggle has been towards representation, towards democracy. Because this is all not just about some kind of abstract rationality that you can impose upon, upon the world. There are questions of interests, there are questions of bias, there are questions of overlooked history. I mean, this is Ambedkar Jayanti today. Today, when we talk about, for example, what AI is trained on, then the biases, the exclusions, who are the people who get excluded there, right? So what is the system meant to do? The idea that no taxation without representation, no legislation without representation, the idea that Ronojoy was talking about, that I should, my elected representative should represent me in that body, has a very deep history that just because we are seeing it being currently practiced in a flawed institution doesn't mean that we should upend all of that history. Now the question is, it's a different question to say, how do we make sure that this parliament works to the best of its ability to uphold those ideas? And if that is the question that you're asking, definitely. But to say that therefore, feed in a problem to ChatGPT, and what ChatGPT tells us, that politics, that legislation or lawmaking is only a technocratic enterprise, I think that's where, unfortunately, that is a bias, particularly in this city, where we've seen a history of saying that technology will set us free, which is not necessary.
What do you have to say?
No, I think Aparna has put it much better than I could have. But just on ChatGPT, I'm sure there'll be improved versions. So I recently did a sort of thought experiment. In my course, I had given them an assignment, and I was checking what ChatGPT comes up with. Usually, as of now, what you do, you get some of the basic stuff right, but beyond that...
Yeah, don't worry about chat. I mean, just give it, let's say super AI.
The biases, the intricacies, I think...
And humans don't have them?
No, humans have them, but, the AI, I think, does it... Pardon?
We also know that AI has them.
I'm not sure,
We just don't, because we didn't invent it, so we...
Sure.
Anyway,
anyway, that's an interesting sort of thought process. But I think, you can't replace, sort of elected representative with sort of technocrats / that's...
Okay,
again,
let me climb down a little bit, okay? Let's say, okay, you guys don't like technology, you don't know how it's designed and what biases are. Look, let's look at it this way. We say, okay, all issues in parliament will be decided by arm wrestling between the leaders of the parties, and the weightage will be given to the number of seats that they have. Right? So Modi ji will have a lot more, Kharge ji will have a lot less. And because I'm going to quote him, okay? Mallikarjun Kharge says today, Parliament has been converted into an area of combat rather than debate, right? So it's become combat. So now all bills are being passed by this. Whatever you want to debate, Rajeev Gowda said this, that, and you debate whatever, the ruling party has the numbers, it carries the house. So why not we decide by arm wrestling? Would that be, no, I'm just being semi-flippant here to bring out the idea that is Parliament an entity with 545 or 800 people, is it bigger than what it's really doing? If we can settle it by arm wrestling on every bill, surrogacy bill, I don't know, IT Act, you just do this and then whoever wins, wins, right?
I mean, that is, I think, the biggest flaw in Parliament today, that it is only a numbers game, right? And that, I think, has to do with a range of things. One is, like we've discussed before, the anti-defection bill, the anti-defection law, the 10th schedule of the Constitution, which essentially says that if you don't toe the party line, then you can be chucked out of the party and lose your seat, which means that party discipline is more important than voting your conscience. You can't vote your conscience. You don't have to convince your bench of the rightness of your decision. You only have to issue a whip, right? So that is one reason. So I mean, I think I take your idea that it has become a combat very seriously. Whether that means that that combat should be institutionalized would be to just compound the problem. The second reason why it has become combat oriented, numbers, in a majoritarian system, numbers will ultimately win out. The question is, how do you hold the government to account for the decisions that it is making, right? There is, for example, our parliament has a non-binding pre-legislative consultative process, right? Which is to say that before a legislation is placed in Parliament, even before it goes to the committee, it should be circulated to the public. There's a notice and comment procedure that has to be followed. Government has to produce a white paper. It has to account for the kind of objections, decisions that have been raised. It has to discuss all of that, deliberate all of that, attach all of that to the bill with the papers of the bill, present it to Parliament, send it to a committee, let it come back, and let us have that deliberation.
Okay,
right?
hold. I'll just ask you one question. You wrote this fantastic long book. How much has all this been done?
It has, I think.
How much? Largely? Mostly? Exceptionally?
I think largely.
Largely?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the due process has been followed. Again, I don't want to, you shouldn't sort of get derailed by the moments of disruption and when. But I think by and large, a lot of this process has been followed. But, to come back to the, arm wrestling thing, it's a feature of, first past the post Westminster democracy, where if you have a party that's won a clear majority, so we've elected them, and they will then, have their sort of say or right in Parliament. So you can't, that's maybe a flaw of the system itself. So it does boil down to that. If you have the numbers, you decide what policy is kosher, right? So if there's a vote in Parliament, it's the party with the majority that...
Yeah. I understand this in theory, but in practice, is this what happens? I mean, from your long study?
No, so what I'm saying is, if you have a dominant party, that's going to happen. In fact, counterintuitively, there have been a lot of people who have argued, or some who have argued, that when we had a coalition era, that's when it was really much more democratic. It seemed messy. It seemed that things weren't moving, or they were moving too slowly. But that's when actually more people had a voice, including many of the regional parties, which you don't have now, which you didn't have for much of the sort of Congress era too. Even though you had very sort of notable opposition figures like J.B. Kripalani in the 60s, someone like Hiren Mukherjee from CPI, excellent debaters, etc. But they weren't really able to influence policy. So so it's oddly enough, it's the coalition era, which, even though it's messy, is, I would say, more democratic in its policy making and functioning.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to do one more level of provocation and then we'll bring all our friends in, okay? Look, we didn't fight for representative democracy, right? We fought for freedom, which meant that I should, as a citizen, I should have a say in the way my country is run, right? Or my city is run, or my state is run. So I never fought for 545 people, or, my great-grandfather, whoever was a freedom fighter, he didn't fight for 545 people to sit in Delhi and make laws for us. He said, look, Indians have to be free, right? And Indians have to be free has a number of solutions than just one solution called representative democracy. Now, if you look at representative democracy, it seems to be an industrial age creation, started in the, France and the United States, where, you had to go on horseback to a capital, then you had to go back to a constituency. You couldn't get all of people to agree because you had 1 million people spread across a huge country. How are you going to get them to vote? So representation made sense, right? It's that you aggregate it in one guy, and we saw during the electoral college in the US election how it happened, right? So you get this person who you appoint as a person who appoint the president, who elect the president on your side. Right? It's the ultimate thing that you repose your trust in this person. It's like you're giving a power of attorney to this person to act on your behalf on political issues, right? That's because in those days you couldn't do it. Today you could have, everybody gets an app called, I don't know, Vote for India app or whatever, right? So you could decide, everybody gets with an Aadhaar. I'm going extremely provocative here, okay? You have an Aadhaar linked voter app. Every single thing which government wants to debate can now come to your app, and it's up to you whether you want to say yes, no, or needs further thought. You can do it today. I mean, people in Bangalore can do it today and launch it if you want, right? So there is a better system. During Churchill's times there wasn't, but today there is. Would you still think that we have to stick with representative democracy?
But see, what you are talking about is still self-governance. Your idea of freedom is still linked to self-governance. The question is where the unit of self-governance should be. Should it be in parliament or should it be closer to you, right? That is essentially.
Or should it be you?
Or should it be you? But
Yeah.
do you think that there is value in you thinking of things for yourself or thinking in community with others, right? Is there a value for you to listen to others, hear them, deliberate with them, and then come to your positions? So the problem that you're identifying might be a problem of centralization. And this is a huge problem, and I think this is a big design problem in our constitution, that we are over-centralized. That was not supposed to be the original design of this constitution, which was a push towards decentralization. After partition happens, the mood of the assembly changes, and there is a move towards greater centralization. There's a history to it, whatever that might be. But imagine if the point that you're saying, right, you go to your BBMP office, and that is a valuable deliberative space. Since we're talking about thought experiments, think about that your local issues, you have your local ward council or your local town hall where you can go and have that deliberative experience, then why not?
But we already have it, but nobody's doing it.
So the problem might not be that it is representative in nature. The problem is that there is over-centralization, that the representation is happening at the central level, or we think that the representation needs to happen at the central level, that there's a whole range. I mean, I teach a whole course on this, but there's a whole range of reasons why there's an over-centralization that has happened, where a lot of our crucial policies that impact me on a day-to-day basis are happening at parliamentary level, or parliament has to look at it rather than my local ward council.
Okay.
No, I agree with what Aparna said, but
No, just don't disrupt. Go on.
no, but what you're also suggesting, I think, has a profoundly anarchist sort of element to it, sort of each to his own, his or her own, sort of using technology, etc. I think, in a way, it probably ties in, you were talking about teaching courses. I teach a course on Gandhi. And I think this sort of ties into, sort of the Gandhian idea of Swaraj, of freedom, very fundamentally different from what, the rest of the Congress, including Nehru, etc., were fighting for. And that's precisely the reason why Gandhi actually also had a profound sort of suspicion of legislatures, deliberative bodies. So I think in a way what you're saying, not the technology bit, because Gandhi was anti-technology to a great extent, I think ties in with a sort of anarchist's worldview of things, where you don't need parliaments, you don't need elected bodies. You can sort of, maybe form your own collective constituency and try and make things happen. I don't know whether it will,
but you want to say what Ambedkar's response to that was also.
And Ambedkar was deeply suspicious of this local thing because of, and I think he's right. He used to talk about anybody who believes in decentralization, go and look at a village panchayat and see what happens. I'll say anybody who looks at decentralization, go to a RWA in Bangalore and see what happens, right? You are not going to get democratic, enlightened way of governance. You're going to get prejudice. You're going to get, power which is centralized along community lines and a whole lot of things which, that's the second set of questions which, it's a good segue into that, right?
And since this is Ambedkar Jayanti, I might as well quote him. In
right.
response to Gandhi said, the villages are a cesspool of corruption.
Yeah.
Right? So,
cesspool of corruption, he meant corruption not in the financial corruption sense. He's talking about the way...
That was a response to Gandhi.
Yeah. Okay, so now it's a good segue into the second question of your book, right? So how has India changed democracy, parliamentary democracy? I think there's a big story here, right? In the sense that, look, here's a fantastic part of the book where he says, look, the way the parliament, how people sit in parliament, determines how parliament conducts itself, right? So there's a lot of deliberation at that time. Should you have the British style parliament where two sides face each other, which is very antagonistic, necessarily adversarial, or this circular way where people sit around and hopefully there's not that much of antagonism, but he also says that, look, they sit on opposite sides and it's still adversarial in a circle. But starting from there and now 70 years of practice into the way we've done democracy, what did you find? What are the biggest ways in which Indian society, Indian polity has changed Westminster-style democracy?
I think, partly because of the scale of Indian democracy, there was very early British observers would come and see that, the form of Indian parliament and the structure and the rules are the same, but in a way it's been sort of, both magnified as well as become, far more sort of noisy, rambunctious, whatever adjective you want to use. So I think that's one aspect, but also in terms of some of the procedural rules, like, the 0 hour where, topics of urgent importance can be raised, the business advisory committee, etc. So there have been also sort of parliamentary, rude tweaks in rulemaking, which I think has also accompanied, the sort of the reformulation in some ways of the Westminster system. So I think, both the scale, the noisiness, as well as, I would say, the procedures.
So if I were to frame this question in this way, does passing the India test qualify parliamentary democracy to be the best form of government? Because if it can survive and do well in India, it can do anything anywhere, right?
Partly, yeah. I think that's one way to put it. Although you'll also, hear a lot of voices now arguing for for a presidential system, for instance, or maybe the proportional, representation PR system. So I think the first past the post system has its sort of obvious flaws, but to go back sort of historically, that was the only option that was realistically considered by the founders, the Constituent Assembly. No other competing system was actually, given much of a chance. I think across the board, that was a consensus, rightly or wrongly. So that's what, was decided on, and that's what we have. And I think along the way, it's been sort of incrementally modified, yeah.
No, do.
Only a couple of things. Yes, I don't think we can think about the institution of parliament without thinking about our model of elections. And I think I completely agree that that's the other side of the story that we need to really excavate, of whether the first past the post system shapes the way in which parliament operates and the incentives and disincentives of political parties and of parliament. There is some literature, and I think Ronojoy alludes to it in his book, where he talks about how, there's a word that's used to describe parliamentary systems of Asia, which is Eastminster, as opposed to Westminster. But one of the aspects of that is a lot of power in the hands of the executive, right? And very little control over the hands of the executive, which means that even in a parliamentary system, the executive, which is supposed to be responsible to parliament, becomes incredibly powerful in the same way as in a presidential system, as in the US, for example, the president is incredibly powerful. So, bringing the present back in, there is a whole sort of concern about what some scholars have called executive aggrandizement. But this entire area of the creeping powers of the executive, where the executive sets the agenda, the executive can pass whatever law it wants, the judiciary is placed a lot of role in allowing the executive to bypass parliament completely and just go through ordinances, the power of the governor, the power to, instead of making laws, making policies on areas. So you just completely bypass parliament. You don't even have to go to parliament for its rubber stamp in a lot of cases. And I think, therefore, the diminishing role of parliament in India is also something, is something that the world is also learning from us. And this is the last chapter where, in Ronojoy's book, where he's talking about autocratization and the shrinking space for deliberation and democracy. One of the story of autocratization in Poland, in Hungary, in Turkey, in Brazil, in all of these places, is the shrinking space for parliamentary, accountability and parliamentary deliberation, and perhaps that's something that the world is learning from us.
Which is, I think,
that's
tied to
Indian innovation as well.
Tied both to a powerful executive as well as a populist.
Populist, exactly.
Elected
And so
leaders.
that's also an innovation of the Indian parliamentary system. We are learning and we are teaching.
Okay.
I think
It's
there are a
open
lot
to all of you.
lot of-
Okay, so how I will do this is, I will, we already did this, so I will come to the front here, the lady in pink, you.
And
Okay.
yellow.
Yellow has a hand up from the
Yellow?
beginning.
Oh, is she? Okay, let's give, let's give yellow and then we'll go to pink. Maybe this is a good way. So we'll I'll look at a shade card and look at the opposite. Okay, yellow or pink and then we'll see. Please, I don't mean to be rude. I don't know your name. So instead of calling you ladies and gentlemen, I think yellow, pink, blue, I think is nicer, right? Gender neutral. Yeah. Try to keep it short and very punchy and hopefully directed at Ronojoy.
No pressure. No, so my question is very, I'll keep it really short. So you spoke about the shrinking role of parliament, and especially in the last 10 years, we've seen, and as a new generation pays attention, and they've started paying more attention in the last 10 years. So do you see that the role of, or the significance of parliament, is it going to diminish further? Is it going to grow into something else entirely? Like, can we see that the parliament is going to take a new form and a new shape that was probably not seen before? What are your thoughts on that? Thank you very much.
Let's take two at a time. Yeah.
I wanted to ask this question long ago, so it may not be relevant anymore, but because we were talking about the disruptions, this is not about the disruptions, but basically what I was asking is, I've not read the book yet, but historically, was there a period in the Indian Parliament which was considered the golden age? Or was there a time when, it was functioning more ideally? And what is that ideal? And which other countries, you think are examples of good parliamentary democracy right now?
Maybe I'll take the second one first, and I'll let you handle the. I think it's the golden age is always a trap that one can fall into. But we did have parliaments of very high parliamentarians of very high caliber. So I think I cite an instance in the provisional parliament where you had a committee which had S.P. Mukherjee, Nehru, Maulana Azad, who's I hear has now been deleted from the NCERT. 11, 12 textbooks, I think Kripalani. So you had, leaders of very high stature, great debaters, etc. So, if you do look at a golden age, it probably was the, 1950s, early 60s. But again, I'd hesitate to sort of label that as a golden age, because even if you sort of look at,
When I say golden age, I do not mean...
No, I'm saying,
about
you had parliamentarians of very high caliber, true, but who were contributing to debate. But for instance, I did follow the Lokpal debate quite closely, and you did see, the interventions, the debates, etc. were, I would say, of reasonably high caliber, even in some of the contemporary debates. So I think I wouldn't say there was a golden age, but probably the parliament functioned at least in terms of hours they sat, in terms of number of sittings. Of course, they were disruption-free. So I would say, the 50s, 60s, and of course the Prime Minister, Nehru, had a very deep commitment to the parliamentary system, which I think, very few future, I think that the rot kind of set in with Indira Gandhi itself, and there are, n number of sort of instances they bring up with. So I think, if there has to be a sort of, golden period, I would say that would be the 50s, 60s, for various reasons, including the commitment of the political leadership to both the form as well as the structure of parliament, which I would say is absent now. And quickly on the examples, I think House of Commons, is dysfunctional at various levels. But just one instance, they have something called, Prime Minister's Question Hour, right? Where every week the Prime Minister is forced to answer questions which are not vetted. They come from the opposition, and they have to do it. The attendance is, I think 90% plus for all Prime Ministers, which is completely lacking. We don't have that institution here. So what we have here is the Prime Minister who will, of course, give speeches in Parliament, address the nation, etc., but is not forced to answer questions posed by the opposition. So I think that's just one minor example of a institutional aspect which Indian parliaments lacks vis-a-vis the British counterpart.
On to the first question, obviously predicting the future is both risky and sometimes a fool's errand, but I fear the path that we are on is moving us in a direction where parliament becomes a rhetorical device, the mother of democracy or whatever it is, and used to legitimize and justify whatever it is that the executive wants to do, both in the eye of the public. Parliament has passed it, so the people have spoken, our representatives, the people have spoken through Parliament. As a lawyer, I follow what happens in courts, and courts give a lot of deference to what Parliament has done and presume that everything that Parliament has done, at least at first blush, is constitutional, unless you can, really show that it is not. And so I have a feeling that the path that we are on means that it becomes that sort of legitimizing, justifying, rhetorical institution, where, what might change it? I don't think that's anything internal to the institution that will have to come from public pressure. That's happened before, and again, Ronojoy documents it. So during the emergency, of course, there were lots of changes brought in to the constitution, and one of the things that immediately after the emergency, there was such a groundswell of opposition that the Janata government had to roll back a lot of those, a lot of the changes that Indira Gandhi had brought in. So I don't think that is impossible, but I don't think we're there yet.
Okay. Blue, brown, and checks. No, I think we'll just go in this order, because Blue, just take the mic if you can. Otherwise, Mr. Blue, you're loud enough. We know you. So, yeah, not loud more. I didn't say that. No. Please, we'll just go in sequence. Blue, brown, and checks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I know. But blue, brown, and checks.
Okay. My name is Muralidhar Rao. Now, Nitin, you said, these, the decentralization is not working too well. And you had said, the RWS, if you go there, Now, I've been part of the RWA and we have been working fairly well. I don't know why you say that.
I'll move to...
And wait a minute.
I'll move to your RWA.
And one more. Decentralization supposedly has worked very well in Kerala. Wouldn't you say that? I don't know. Then another question to Ronojoy. This rating of democracies, the VDEM and other people, other institutions, the Swedish institutions have rated them. And of course, the BJP and the government have said that's all humbug. Now, as an independent observer, how would you rate Indian democracy in the true sense of the term democracy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Brown.
I was a little surprised by one of the questions that was asked, and that was that an important function of a parliamentarian is to get re-elected. I think surprised is not the right word. I was shocked. I was born into a political family, opposition political family, and there used to be a chief minister here called Kadidal Manjappa. He was briefly chief minister about 70 years ago. After he stopped being chief minister, and I was taken up by what was said, that in the early days, 33% or roughly that were lawyers, and now it's down to about a tenth of that. He went back to being a lawyer. Now, he landed up without owning a single house in which he could live. He was living in a rented house with a house which was being rented by his daughter. Now, the reason that I'm bringing up this point is it's very easy to be cynical about many of these issues and I'm not saying that the early 1950s were the best period of our democracy, etc., but there have been people for whom making money or getting re-elected or exercising their muscle power was not the only function of being a parliamentarian. It's very easy to forget that and assume that the only thing that we need of our parliamentarians is to solve our drainage problems or our bus shelter problems or a Hindutva agenda or something else.
Mr. Checks.
Mr. Checks.
Thank you. Picking up on something upper... Sorry. So, hi. Picking up on something Aparna said, right? As of now, all of the opposing, so to speak, is done by the opposition, right? And if you look at Parliament as a place where almost all of the MPs are from a particular party, but they aren't openly allowed to oppose, debate, all of that, right? Is that a fundamental flaw with the way things are structured, A? B, are there probably options like JPCs, right, which could serve as some kind of a safety valve? And C, if laws go through something like a JPC, for example, right, and are then presented to the Lok Sabha, would that address the fundamental issue that it's more of a rubber stamp as opposed to saying that it's a forum for you to debate?
This is the thing about lawyers in Parliament. He was allowed one question, but he did section A, B, and C, and luckily he didn't do A sub 1 and sub 2, right? So this is why we should be careful about lawyers in Parliament. Anyway, we have 2 minutes in which to conclude this. Why don't you go first, and then Ronojoy, you can have the last word.
Sure, then let me just address Leher's question. So Leher, when the reason why MPs can't vote their conscience and really can't oppose the party line is because of the 10th schedule, the anti-defection law, which puts that into place. So that's coming in the 1985-86. Yeah, 85 is when it is coming in. It was not actually part of the original design, and so it could go away, right? So, I mean, that is one aspect of it. The concern was horse trading, essentially. On JPCs actually are fair, or other parliamentary committees, not just joint parliamentary committees, but parliamentary committees are good deliberative spaces, and Ronojoy has an entire chapter on that. The reports that come out are actually fairly good. The the problems that there are two. One is the reports are not binding. Second is that the government gets to appoint the majority. So again, beyond the point, there isn't too much of space for dissent, right? But other parliamentary systems, Canada, for example, Australia, to some extent in the UK, have put in more rigid parliamentary structures with mandatory scrutiny and, different levels of bindingness to these committees. So yes, that is one way in which the opposition as well as members of the ruling party can come in and have their voices heard as members of parliament rather than as members of their political parties.
Okay. Right. Yeah, I think we're out of time, but very quickly, I do agree there are politicians who, maybe were so-called Gandhian in their ways. And, re-election did not matter. But I think that's a clear minority today. If you sort of look at, maybe in the past you had, and maybe you still do have a few. And on the second, your first question on the surveys, you can quibble with the methodology followed by surveys, but the fact is that institutions have been undermined. If you just look at over the last 8 or 10 years across a range of institutions, and this includes Parliament. And I think the change has been incremental. So I think the phrase used by the legal scholar Tarunab Khaitan, I quite like it, 1,000 cuts. So I think that's probably one of the best ways to describe, and Parliament has been, has also, I think, been greatly diminished, and that's what I try and look in the last chapter, where I sort of document some of the reason why I called today's Parliament a diminished Parliament. With some of the problems afflicting Parliament, of course, have an older vintage, but I think some of them, have been accentuated over the last, say 8 or 10 years.
Thank you.
Just leaving aside the surveys and whatever methodology they followed.
Thank you. I just want to end this fantastic conversation because you people have been very nice and sporting. You've been very nice and sporting. So was Professor Gowda. So thank you very much. It was good. I just want to end this on a quote from Ambedkar. My favorite quote from Ambedkar's speech, which is the Grammar of Anarchy speech, which is appropriate. He says, he's referring to, the people saying this constitution is good or bad, right? So he says, however good a constitution may be, it is sure to turn out bad because those who are called upon to work it happen to be a bad lot. However bad a constitution may be, it may turn out to be good if those who are called to work it happen to be a good lot. The Constitution can only provide for organs of state such as the legislature, the executive, the judiciary. The factors on which the working of those organs of state depends are the people and the political parties they will set up as their instruments to carry out their wishes and their politics. So on this note,
and can I just
friends,
add something?
Yeah, sure.
Since it's Ambedkar Jayanti. One of the things he also said was that elections provide a sort of 5-year, stock taking every 5 years or 4 years. But Parliament is where you have a daily assessment. I think that was the phrase used by Ambedkar.
Yeah.
And that's why Parliament is, so important. And that's maybe where.
Yeah. And I would just use Ambedkar's speech to say that the ball is in our court, right? He's thrown the ball in our court. Those guys are just cut off the same cloth as the rest of us. So if we do a better job, I suppose they'll do a better job in their work. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend.